All right, so the first step of understanding anything is being able to explain it to a friend or explain it to a 5-year-old. And this is the famous Feynman technique, famously named after the famous physicist Richard Feynman, who was aptly known as the Great Explainer. And Feynman was a big deal back in the day before he died because he was able to, distill really complicated things in theoretical physics in a way that made sense to the layperson. And the reason he was able to do that is because he understood the topic so well. And once you've understood a topic well enough, you can just explain it to anyone. And that is the key principle behind the Feynman technique. And that's our key litmus test for whether we really understand something. And so the way we do that is that whenever we're learning a topic, what I would do is that after I've kind of learned the topic, or sort of at every junction within the topic, I would ask myself, does this make sense, firstly? And secondly, could I explain this to a 5-year-old? So let's say in medicine, I'm trying to learn about how atrial fibrillation works, for example. I might explain that, atrial fibrillation is actually this heart rhythm where the atria are quivering. Fibrillation means quivering. And therefore, that means that we're going to get stasis of blood. So blood is going to stay in the atrium because it's not being contracted and propelled into the ventricles. And we know that when blood is static in the atrium, then it's going to clot. And that clot can go into the ventricles and then can go into the lungs or can go into the brain, and that would be bad. And so that's me sort of explaining it to a 5-year-old, but this whole 5-year-old thing is it's a bit of a metaphor really, because obviously a 5-year-old wouldn't know what the atria of the heart are, but that is reasonable assumed knowledge when I'm trying to explain it to a friend. And so the way I think about it is, could I feasibly explain this to a friend? And if I can talk through atrial fibrillation in a way that makes sense in my head and makes sense in a way that I can explain it to someone else, it means I truly understand the topic. But if I'm trying to understand any topic and I ever get to the point where I think, okay, A doesn't, in my head, I can't explain why A leads to B. I don't get how they got from this step to that step, whether that's in medicine, physics, science, maths, engineering, whatever. If I don't understand how they got from A to B, that means I know that I wouldn't be able to explain it to a 5-year-old or explain it to a friend. Because if I was explaining it to a friend or a 5-year-old or a student or whatever, they would ask why. And the more times they ask why, the more I'm sort of testing my understanding of the topic. And if I can't feasibly answer the question of why, that means I don't understand it well enough. And so at that point, I would go back to the source material, to Google, Wikipedia, textbook, lecture notes, asking the professor or whatever. And I would try and figure out what is the answer to that particular question? Why can't I explain that bit of it? And then once I've got that piece of information, then it'll start clicking in my head again and be like, oh, this makes sense. I can now explain this to a 5-year-old. And so that's basically the Feynman technique in action. It's just basically asking ourselves, do we actually understand this thing? And kind of going back to what we said right at the start of the class, understanding is by far the most important part of effective studying. Without understanding, there is literally no point in memorizing anything. And I know it can be tempting sometimes to think, oh, well, I won't bother understanding this proof. I'll just memorize it and then I'll be able to regurgitate it in the exam. But that's really a generally ineffective way to learn. Step number 1 is always to understand. And in order to understand, you can use the Feynman technique, which involves requiring yourself to explain stuff to a 5-year-old or to explain stuff to a friend. And I've been using this for years and I think it's absolutely fantastic. Okay, so some more general tips for using the Feynman technique. Firstly, the most important thing is that we keep the language simple. So earlier in my explanation of the, how atrial fibrillation works, I know in my head what the atria are, but I could, if I was doing Feynman technique properly and explaining it to a 5-year-old, I would say, okay, well, the atria are the 2 top chambers of the heart. And because the heart is split up into 4 chambers, you've got the ventricles at the bottom and you've got the atria at the top. Blood goes from the atria to the ventricles and then gets pumped all around the body. But if the atria aren't working very well, if they're quivering rather than contracting, then squeezing, then the blood is going to stay hanging out in the atria, in the top chamber of the heart. And that's bad because when blood hangs around in the top chamber of the heart for a very long time, it can clot and you can get this little stone-like thing of blood. And that's not very good because if that goes into your lungs or goes into your brain, it means that the blood won't be able to flow past this. It's like having a pebble in a pipe and the water can't flow through the pipe. And therefore that's going to be bad because you need blood to give oxygen to your brain and to your lungs and everything. And if you don't have oxygen, then your brain is going to die. And that's what we call a stroke. Or if you don't get oxygen to your heart is going to die. And that's what we call a heart attack. So that would be sort of the trying to keep it really almost patronizingly simple. But I think once you can explain any kind of concept like that, that means you truly understand it. And secondly, another thing that I find helpful when doing Feynman technique, especially for more complex subjects, is really trying to drill down to what is the essence. How can I summarize the answer to this question as simply as possible in as few words as possible? So for example, one of the essays that I prepared in my 3rd year of medicine where I was studying psychology was, to what extent do animals have a theory of mind? That is a really long thing that you can write 20,000 words on. But to what extent do animals have a theory of mind? After I've understood the topic well enough, I can basically summarize it by saying, to what extent do animals have a theory of mind? Well, the answer is, they don't really, but that's the wrong question to be asking. And that's just my sort of top line summary. They don't really have a theory of mind, but that's just the wrong question to ask. And that insight comes from understanding the topic so well through like sort of a whole day of researching it and looking at papers and stuff, that to be able to get to that conclusion is sort of the point. It's the Feynman technique in action. It means that I've understood the topic, and that means that even better, when I'm writing the essay, I've got this thread that I can argue all the way through. And if someone is marking that essay, it really shows to the examiner that I've understood the topic, that I know what I'm talking about, because I've got a coherent argument running all the way through. Also, there's a friend of mine, Angus, who's helping make this video. He's sitting right there. Hi, Angus. He uses the Feynman technique as well, and he discovered this when he was in his third year of studying geography at Cambridge University. And he said that he was really struggling with his dissertation. It was like some really complicated thing, and he was struggling to kind of see the forest from the trees. So he was like so focused on the details of this dissertation that he couldn't really get the big picture. And so what he tried to do is one day he went home and he tried to explain the topic as simply as he could to his parents. And he found that just the act of explaining this to his parents really helped solidify and, simplify all of the concepts in his own mind. And then he bashed out his dissertation and got a high first class in that. So, Feynman technique in action. Well done, Richard Feynman. You've done us a great service by teaching us about this method. Moral of the story, we need to understand stuff before we can do anything else with it. And in order to understand stuff, we need to be able to explain it to a 5-year-old, explain it to a friend, explain it to our parents. So thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.